Well, happy Valentine's Day and welcome to the seventh day of the 15th annual Transforming the Teaching and Learning Environment virtual conference. I'm Bob Hales. I'm your moderator. As you can see, our session is how the metaverse can improve student engagement and learning using augmented augmented reality and virtual reality in the classroom. We're fortunate to have with us J.J. Wallace, who is an assistant professor of health and exercise science at Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky. She focuses her pedagogical practices around diversity, equity, and inclusion, technology in the classroom, and flipped classroom. Well, JJ, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Bob. And thank you for inviting me today. And I'm really excited to talk with everyone about the metaverse and augmented reality and virtual reality and how it can be used successfully in the classroom to improve student engagement and learning. I'm just going to go over a couple of objectives for this presentation. The first is we're going to talk about what is augmented reality and virtual reality, and then how it can be used effectively in the classroom, and then a little bit about implications and issues of use in the classroom. So some of the issues that others as well as I have run into when using this technology. Just a little bit of background to get us started, get us thinking about augmented reality and virtual reality in the metaverse. We're going to talk about what these technologies are, and I'm going to give you some examples of prominent technologies that have been used in certain, both for entertainment, for shopping, as well as for education. Just quickly, let's go ahead and just, if you wouldn't mind to share, there's only a couple of us today, so we already sort of talked about this, but I'd like to hear a couple more about your experience with AR and VR. Would anyone like to share that quickly with us? Just Hillary or Dan?
Sure.
Go ahead, Hillary.
Okay, thanks. Well, my background is actually I have an MFA in creative writing, so I came to this not knowing anything really about AR and VR when I started teaching the course. So I've slowly been becoming more familiar with different types of immersive experiences, and really with a focus on understanding how they're structured as stories or not structured as stories, right? But I would say I'm very much like a novice, very much in learning mode, very eager to hear about all different kinds of uses of AR and VR, and would love at some point to be able to offer some aspects of my course in AR and VR. It's just that probably is a lot more work than I'm able to get up and running quickly. So
yes, absolutely. Thank you, Hillary, for sharing that. How about you, Dan?
Yeah, my experience is comes out of the education space, where we develop and publish material for different authors who may want to author material, and we're interested in how, well, I'm interested more than my partner, but I'm interested in how someone uses AR, VR when 80% of the faculty don't want to develop their own material.
Yeah.
How are they going to get into it? And so forth. You're always going to have those entrepreneurial people who want to get into it and develop it, but then you've got those who want to use it as an education tool. Question is, where is that material coming from? How is that going to be distributed, and so forth and so on? Because that's what we do, as we help build out those pipelines for people who want to use that kind of material, reuse the material. Because I mean, how many labs are there? There's only so many labs that you can do. The question is why does everybody need to create their own lab? And that's what I want to know.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dan. Bob, do you have experience in virtual reality?
Just from observing, others at this point, uh, you know, it's great Shenandoah and having a degree program in it because we need more designers.
Yes, we
And
do.
I always wondered if at what point, what's the tipping point? Is it textbook publishers start
Mhm.
adding this, just like they
Mhm.
will add, a PowerPoint file or something, because it doesn't seem cost efficient for every institution to be
Right.
doing this and perhaps duplicating what somebody else is. So,
Absolutely.
But
Yeah, these are all great points.
be careful what you ask for. If you get the publishers involved, be careful what you ask for.
But yeah, and it's a really good question as well, though. Like, what sphere is going to push this over the edge into everyday use? And I think that's a really interesting topic that we could hit on later if we'd like to in this presentation. Thank you for sharing a little bit about your background with these technologies. I'm going to give you some simple definitions so that as we're talking about these things, everyone's going to be on the same page. So when we're thinking about augmented reality, this is really when you have technology that is superimposing computer generated images on your view of the real world. So it's a composite view. So you may have some things that are in the real world and then some things that are being displayed through your device. You can do augmented reality with a lot of different technologies. You can do it with something as simple as your cell phone or your iPad, or you can have something as expensive as Microsoft HoloLens, which you see here in the corner. And then some of the more virtual reality headsets are starting to also integrate into augmented reality now. So things that we typically thought were just virtual reality are now being used in augmented reality. So some examples of everyday life and how people are using augmented reality. I'm going to show you some of these videos quickly. And what you're going to see is this is IKEA, and they allow you to place the furniture in your home without actually buying it first. So you use your phone, your iPad, your computer, and it uses the camera. You open the app and you can place the furniture wherever you'd like it to be. It scans your environment and you can try out that furniture before you buy it. So you can see through the picture on his phone that he's showing you what this chair would look like in his space. So it's a really interesting way for companies to be able to show you what their products would look like in your home. And it takes away the problems you're seeing there of, is this going to fit in my space? What's this going to look like? Another example is for the art world is there's a really interesting app called Sketch AR. And what this does is it allows you to sort of have a outline of what you want to draw superimposed on your paper so that you can then draw it. And it's actually a really amazing program. I'm going to let it play for just a second so we can get to the point where, here we go, where you can see this person is going to draw a face. And as they hold their camera, they're able to sort of outline that picture on the real piece of paper. It's a really interesting application, and a lot of people are using this to learn to draw and to learn to do different types of art. For those of you in the sciences, this is called the Human Anatomy Atlas, and it has an augmented reality application that allows you to view the human body in the real world as if it were laying on your table. And cadavers are really, really expensive in the real world for medical schools and physical therapy, occupational therapy schools. And so if the ability to have a cadaver that is not actually real, but you could still manipulate it, see it, it's really amazing. So you can see now through the iPad app, you're able to see the body on the table, so to speak, and you can manipulate those areas of the body, make them bigger, smaller. You can click on them. It tells you what they are. It's a really great way to study anatomy, especially if you don't have access to a huge cadaver lab. That's a little bit about augmented reality. So virtual reality is a little bit different, where it is actually a computer simulated 3D environment that it allows you to sometimes interact and explore within the environment. But the difference is you no longer see the real world around you. You're completely immersed 360 degrees. And I sort of think about these experiences in two ways. You really have more passive virtual reality experiences where you're kind of taking a back seat, you don't interact a lot, and you're mostly watching, versus active experiences where you're actually taking part in the story, in the experience. You're having to move your body, you're making choices, you're interacting with your environment. One of the most classic examples of passive VR is YouTube VR. A lot of people don't know this actually exists, but what it is YouTube has an entire section and catalog of videos that are dedicated to just virtual reality. And you can make these videos. A lot of them are user made, just like most YouTube videos are. And I can guarantee if you can think of a topic that someone has made a 360-degree video for VR about your topic, whether it is hiking a particular trail, whether it's a particular city of history that you want to explore. You can find so many videos here that can be used as a learning opportunity. Quill, this is going to be particularly interesting to some of you. Quill is a really great VR storytelling tool. And what you can do is you can actually create stories as well as view stories other people have created in virtual reality. And virtual storytelling, when you look at this picture, we're still viewing this in 2 dimensions. And unfortunately, you don't get the full experience unless you're really there. So Quill is actually creating 360-degree environments. So when you talk about storytelling, you're in the room with the story while it happens. And it's this really amazing new way to tell stories. And there are some really amazing work being done by individuals as well as companies about this virtual storytelling. And Quill is just a really interesting way and pretty much free way to do this. The Anne Frank House. This is actually an app I'm currently using in one of my classes where I'm teaching virtual reality, and it's also it's a history telling of Anne Frank and the home that she lived in, and so there's excerpts through the diary, and they've actually recreated the actual house that they lived in directly. They worked with the organization that runs the Anne Frank House, and they recreated the actual space in virtual reality, so that as you're standing in a bedroom, you actually feel that it's in real dimension. So as small as it was is how you feel when you're in there. I've had students tell me they felt very claustrophobic while viewing this app, and that's because it was so small. But it was true representation of the real Anne Frank home. And throughout it's a storytelling experience. You walk throughout the home and you hear excerpts from the diary and the story of Anne Frank and how they lived in the annex. And so it's a really great application. For those of you who teach things like writing and speech and communication, there's actually an application called Virtual Speech. And what this does is it simulates for you an audience. You can practice your presentations. You can pull it up just like you would in the real world. You can pick whether you want a conference room, a classroom, a meeting room. You can pull up your slides behind you. You can go through your presentation, and you can, at the end of it, it tells you different metrics about where you were looking. Did you project well? What was your speaking level, just like reading level? What level were you speaking at? And this is actually a really interesting app. And I've had a few students try this out in my class, and they said that it was actually really interesting. And so you can see here, there's the words are going through that you can practice, and it tells you whether you need to go faster or slower. But it's actually, so here's a picture of those metrics, and it just helps you practice your ability to give a good speech or a good talk in front of other individuals. One of the last I want to share with you is Google Earth. And Google has created, you can obviously do Google Earth on your desktop. However, they've created a VR mode. And unfortunately, you have to be tethered to your computer in some capacity, whether it is through a Bluetooth link or whether it's just through a cord plugged into a computer. But you have to be tethered for Google VR, unfortunately. it cannot be used on its own. And that's because it has such a high rendering rate, because the images are so robust. What you're seeing is someone navigating through, I believe that's New York City, and I'm not exactly sure which mountain this is, but this is Paris, and they're traveling through the world, and you can literally dive down and go from street level to as if you are flying in a drone or an airplane, and you can go anywhere in the world at any moment. And so there are places you can click on, certain places, and it will tell you stories about, let's say that was the Colosseum. You click on the Colosseum, it'll tell you a story about this place and what it is. And it's a really amazing application, especially if you want to teach students about other places, but obviously don't have the budget to take them anywhere. And so through augmented reality and virtual reality, we have something called the metaverse. And what this is a place and space in which people can interact with each other in this computer generated environment. And unfortunately, we are in the part of the work. Well, the way the metaverse is shaping up right now is you have multiple little metaverses, to where you have Facebook's version of the metaverse. You have a company called Spatial and their version of the metaverse. And then you have all of Fortnite and Unity and their version of the metaverse. And so you have all of these tiny little metaverses that you can go in and interact through a computer generated environment with others. But unfortunately, what we don't have is a connection between those yet. And that's really what is lacking in terms of creating something that can actually be used across platforms. So that's one of the problems we currently have. But the metaverse is in development, and there are many companies trying to make this a reality. This is just quickly, I'm going to play this video for you. This is the Meta Horizon Worlds, and this is the Meta, formerly known as Facebook's sort of metaverse. And they show you how you can create your own worlds. You can visit those worlds, and you can speak to others and talk to others. Just the other night, I'm about to have my students start interacting in a social capacity in the metaverse and in one of my classes. And I've been doing it, so I know how to, help them. And just the other night, I was in a comedy bar with about 30 other people from around the United States, and we were watching people do different comedy routines. And it was actually really interesting. And after a few minutes, you kind of forget that you're this tiny little avatar in this computer generated world that looks like a cartoon, and you start thinking of it as the real world for a few minutes. So it was really interesting. If you have not experienced the metaverse, I encourage you to do so. It can be a really interesting experience. So now I'd like to talk just a little bit about why VR feels so real to individuals. And that may sound interesting to you if you've never been in virtual reality, but it does feel real. And that's because of the immersion aspect. When you are in virtual reality, your vision is completely immersed from the real world in this virtual environment. And wherever you look is where you see something new. Just like you do in the real world, as your head moves, your vision moves with your head. And that's one of the things that makes this immersive. The other is the auditory feedback that you get. They're doing really amazing things with the way in which sound is being mimicked like the real world in virtual reality, so that as you walk closer to something that's making a noise, the noise gets louder. As you get further from it, it gets like it is getting softer. So it's mimicking those real world, the way in which sound works in the real world. And so that makes it feel more real. And then the last is that we're doing some really interesting things with touch and haptics to get feedback. Right now, the main way we get feedback is through our hands and the controllers that we're using, but there are a lot of companies, including Tesla, that are creating these full body chest suits and gloves that you can put on that are trying to mimic the feeling of touching things or being touched while in virtual reality. So this technology is not quite where it needs to be, but it is being investigated by some pretty prominent corporations right now. There's an entire bit of literature on embodiments, and what embodiment research tells us is that the more you feel like the virtual reality body is your body, the more you believe the experience is actually happening to you. And so they've done some research where they had a little bit of augmented reality experience happening, where they had the person's real hand on the table and then they had a virtual hand next to that hand that was a mirror image. And so let's say my left hand was behind my back, but I had a left virtual hand displayed on the table, and they would do things like touch the real hand, and they would mimic touching it. And then they would do things like poke it with a needle, and you would feel that slight pain response. And then they would do things to the other virtual hand, and people would say that eventually they started to actually feel as if that was happening to them. And so they would start to pull their virtual hand away when they would go to poke them with the needle, because they were expecting it to actually hurt. So there's a lot of interesting research on the more you can make someone feel like this is their body, the more they actually feel like it's happening to them. So this leads me now, all of that background, to how can this be used effectively? And there's been some really interesting review papers in the past couple of years that have been really systematically looking at this. And there's a great review paper from 2020 that was looking at design elements and the application of immersive virtual reality in higher education. And they looked at about 38 articles that were published from 2016 to 2018. And what they found was that, unfortunately, there's not a lot of mention of actual learning theories and how you tie virtual reality into your learning theories. And so that's a gap in the research. We need more research in the classroom and not just a pilot course. So you may pilot a particular activity or something outside of your course, but people are not actually putting this into their actual learning objectives. They're not putting this into the classroom in a real setting, and it's mostly just pilot work. Again, there's little to no research on learning outcomes as well as theories. So how did the impact of VR impact the learning outcome itself? So we're lacking in that. And we also need more training for best practices between disciplines. So back in 2022, we said we needed these things. And so in response, and they actually, before I move on, they had some recommendations. And some of those recommendations say that you need to move, you need to do practice-oriented content. So that means content that they would, particularly in the real world, have trouble doing over and over and over, maybe because of limited supplies or limited room or limited time. You could actually get students in a practice environment more and get more hands-on learning through virtual reality. The best example of this would be in the medical world, where if you are a surgeon in training and you need to practice a particular, let's say, arthroscopic procedure, instead of doing that on a real human being for the first time you ever do this is through a real human, or maybe a simulation lab. Maybe you've practiced this 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 times in virtual reality. And that gives you more hands-on practice, more time to catch those mistakes. And also it allows students to work on soft skills like communication, collaboration, and their behavior. And you can do that in an environment where you can create safety rules that are very similar to the real world. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. The next article that I wanted to share with you was the impact of VR on engagement and performance in the classroom. And this was an article from 2021. And they looked at 6 research articles that assessed the engagement piece of virtual reality. And they found that as compared to a traditional teaching approach, virtual reality always improves student engagement. And that's because it's novel, it's interesting, it's fun, it's different. Students really tend to like it. So it doesn't surprise me at all that every single study about engagement says that students felt more engaged while in virtual reality. The difference here is the performance side. And so if you look at the performance side, you'll see that looking at 24 different interventions, only 11 of them showed a positive performance as a result of virtual reality inclusion. 7 showed a decrease in performance and 6 showed no change in performance. I think this is the key here, is that we're not consistently able to assess performance in a way, or we're not getting the performance results from virtual reality that we want. Yes, they're engaged, but we're not always getting that performance level that we were hoping for. And what this tells us is that obviously virtual reality will never replace in-person or on-site experiences. If you can go to, let's say, Paris, go to Paris. If you can't, go to Paris in virtual reality. It's a good substitute, but it'll never replace that in-person experience. For things like laboratory experiences where you might have limited budget, limited resources, you can only do an experiment one time. Unfortunately, in the real world, you're limited by those things. In virtual reality, you are not. You can reset that experiment and do it as many times as you need to in order to learn the concepts that you're supposed to be learning. And also for online learning environments, contact in those remote settings in classrooms was improved through virtual reality. So people felt more like they were around other people in virtual reality than they were, let's say, on Zoom or on a conference that's in 2 dimensions, like we are today. If we were all sitting together in virtual reality, the social aspect tends to be improved. And obviously novelty increases interest, but the problem with that, with engagement, comes if the student and the teacher are not prepared. It can hinder that learning process. Another great review article in 2021, and I can provide to you the slide deck, and you can, and all of these articles are linked, and they are all free for access through the internet, so you can get to these articles. So VR in the Classroom was a review article in 2021. They reviewed 33 articles, and they looked at the use of VR for language learning, computer science, business, education, science, and engineering. And those were the top fields that they were looking at that have been using virtual reality. And they assessed the design methodology. So they were saying, hey, how did you use VR in what capacity? And then what type of results did you have? And out of those 33 articles, 28 reported positive results for VR, which is very, very promising. So 28 out of 33, that's a pretty high percentage. And what they found was that the majority of the methodology that we were using virtual reality for was collaborative learning. So if you look at this sort of, these are the 33 articles. 10 of them looked at project-based learning in a collaborative environment. 8 of them looked at problem-based learning collaboratively, and 7 at learner-centered learning collaboratively. And then the least over here on the right-hand side, these were individual sort of assessments. So learner-centered learning without collaboration, problem solving without, and then game-based learning. So you can see that virtual reality is really being used in that collaborative space. So it's a really great way to get students working together. This is probably the most helpful article that I have ever used or seen. And this is an article that is assessing, sort of looked at all of the virtual reality literature up to 2022, and they found best practices. And I've used this a lot, and I think this is a great way to get started in the classroom and also to remind us where we need to go when we are assessing or when we're creating virtual reality content for the classroom. The first piece is preparation, because unfortunately, we as the instructors, we have to do a lot of prep work. First thing you have to always do is reflect on your course content, your course goals, your course objectives, and say, how can me adding in a virtual reality component actually improve student outcomes? Because you always want this to be related back to your content and related back to your learning outcomes. If you cannot do that, then you probably shouldn't use VR for that particular assignment, because you don't want to use VR for every assignment. There's a place for it, just like there is any other type of learning sort of theory or learning objectives. The next piece you have to think of is the accessibility piece. Unfortunately, virtual reality is very hands-on. Some applications require students to stand up, move their bodies. Some can be very passive where you can sit down and do these. So you need to be thinking about, who is your student body? What accessibility needs do they have? And how can I ensure that they have equal opportunity to learn if I'm going to use virtual reality? And perhaps this individual has a health condition that would preclude them from using virtual reality. Then you would think, okay, now what am I going to do? How am I going to account for that? And one really great way is that most virtual reality headsets will remote to a device. so that a person can watch in 2 dimensions what that person is doing. So you can have have people work in pairs. So you always have to think about accessibility. Pre-use testing, you always have to do whatever it is you want them to do first. And that's like anything, right? If you're going to assign something for your students, if you're going to assign a reading, you're going to read it first. And so that you understand what they're going to get from that reading, as well as how it fits into the larger scheme of your sort of course plan. And so pre-use testing is huge. And pre-use testing allows you to have a plug and play experience, so that when the students come in the classroom, they put the headset on, they hit the play button for that application, and they go. And that's because you don't want there to be any mystery, because that's actually one of the things that we've been discovering, is that if an application is hard to use and there's not good instructions, the student learning severely decreases. So it needs to be a plug and play experience, and you only can figure that out through pre-use testing. Once you do all of this preparation for virtual reality, you can then implement this. And first thing you have to think of for implementation is physical space. Students need a 5 by 5 foot space in order to do virtual reality that requires body movement. And that's the minimum. Ideally, if you had more, that's great, but you don't have to have more than that. If you're going to do passive experiences, you just need them to have a space where they can sit down and stretch out their arms all around them without touching someone else. So you have to think physical space. What am I going to need? How much space? And fortunately, my university, we had a cafeteria space that was no longer being used, and it had a large open room, as you can imagine, cafeteria spaces had. And so we have now transitioned that space into a virtual reality laboratory, where we have space. We have a 5 by 5 meter space, or 5 by 5 foot space for 20 students marked off, so that students can be safe in those spaces. The next piece is to give a tutorial. That means that before you go into this experience, you need to tell them how this is going to work. And you would do that just like you would for any assignment. You're not just going to give your student a 1-sentence instruction of how to do something. You're going to give them instructions. You're going to help them get to where they need to go. The same for virtual reality. You have to give them a tutorial. I always like to say that virtual reality is fun, but sometimes for learning purposes, it's not always the fun that they expect it to be. So you always augment these experiences with a little bit of fun in however capacity that you have. You might find an interesting video for them to watch before or after. And then it's always important, after they do this virtual reality experience, to follow up with an assessment of their learning experience. And I've been using the concept of a journal. And so every time my students this semester have went into our virtual reality lab space, they've completed some sort of assignment that I've created, then they have a follow-up journal entry where they answer very specific questions that will lead them to hopefully get the learning outcome that I was hoping for with that experience. And so the follow-up assessment is key. It has to happen. Otherwise, why do the VR experience? And what I have found, and what I think research supports, is that VR is one of the best ways for students to collaborate. Again, especially if you have limited physical resources that can be used up quickly for experimentation, for design, for a lot of other things. So VR is a huge, a really interesting way for students to collaborate. It's also cross-disciplinary, which is something that we all hope to do, right? We love to bring in other areas. We love to cross disciplines. We love to hopefully have that more well-rounded education, and VR has the ability to do that. It's a tool that can be used across disciplines, which I think is really interesting. There's a few implications of use. For equipment considerations, if you're considering doing this for a large classroom, and for me, a large classroom is 20 or more. So if you think about a classroom of 150, 200 students, AR/VR is probably not VR specifically is not going to be very feasible. Maybe augmented reality if everyone has their own cell phone device. But if you're thinking virtual reality, the metaverse, and learning in that environment, you really do need to think about the type of headset and equipment that you need, as well as the number of headsets that you're going to need. My university purchased 20 so we can accommodate up to 20 students in one given session of virtual reality. And also you have to think about the cost for applications, because unfortunately these apps are being created either by individuals or companies. And these companies are, of course, want a profit from their applications. And that makes total sense, right? And so you have to make sure that you have the money to purchase applications. And you also have to think about, if you're trying to find free alternatives, is the free alternative going to be a quality experience as compared to the paid alternative? So you have a lot of things to weigh there. You also think about time considerations. It takes time to set up this space every day. You have to familiarize yourself with the equipment. You have to think about your learning objectives and then also do a follow-up. So all of that takes time, and that takes time away from the actual experience in the metaverse. You have to set it up. You got to familiarize yourself with what's going on. Then students have to do that post sort of assessment. So you have to consider all of that time. And then I like to think about resource consideration, because this takes a lot of faculty training. How are you going to get your faculty to actually use this is by teaching them first, right? We never want to go in the classroom having not experienced something first before we do that with our students. So faculty training is a must. And then you also have to have continuing education, because if you don't use something, you lose it. I'm sorry, if you use VR today, you don't use it for a year, you're going to forget how to use it. And then you also have to consider, should we hire someone in our Center for Teaching and Learning that has experience in virtual reality so that they can actually facilitate this across campus? And then do we not want to just use pre-made applications and programs? Do we want to develop our own content? And if you want to develop your own content, you're going to have to either learn to do that yourself or hire developers and designers that will do this for you. So there's a lot of resource considerations here. I would say that my particular university has sort of jumped on this bandwagon a little bit. We are working with faculty training right now. Last summer, the summer of 2022, we did a virtual reality workshop. We had funding for 15 faculty, and for 1 week we met and we just really worked through, what is this technology and how can we use this in our classrooms? And I'm happy to say that all of the faculty that attended that have at some point, either in the fall or in the spring semester, used virtual reality in their classrooms in some capacity. So if you teach people how to use this, let them find the best way that the best way to use it for their learning objectives, they're going to use it. And so it's really just getting faculty to do that. And unfortunately, we're all so busy. We have very little time. So you have to have some sort of incentive for that. If you can incentivize your faculty, that's a really great way to do that. And we're lucky that we have a digital specialist on our campus, and they are the person that is doing the setup with the headsets. They're ensuring all the applications are being downloaded, and they're really taking care of this equipment for us. So that's that staffing piece that you need. And so you have to just really think about that resource and how am I going to make this happen? Because unfortunately, unlike some things we do in our classroom where you might give students a PDF of an article, this takes a little bit more consideration of what are my resources. Some things you have to consider for your students is, first and foremost, is motion sickness. This is #1 complaint in virtual reality, unfortunately. And it happens because applications do not have a high frame rate. Unfortunately, frame rates of, I think, anything less than 90 frames per second can induce motion sickness in some individuals. And people who are already prone to motion sickness are more likely to get motion sick in virtual reality. So that's something you need to pre-warn your students about. You also need to think about students who might have sensory processing issues, maybe your neurodivergent students, students with ADHD, perhaps even physical limitations. What is this going to do for them? And if they can't use it safely, they shouldn't be using it. So we have to think about how that's going to work in your classroom. Trigger warnings are huge because, especially in places like social environments, you have little to no control of what other people are doing in virtual reality. I have an interesting story about this because during our workshop, we had one of our theater professors actually went into the Horizon Worlds application and was just looking around and trying to see what was going on. Another avatar walked up to them and said, "I'm going to kill you," and mimicked stabbing them with a knife in their hand. And so that was very triggering for that person. They pulled their headset off. They were like, "I was just literally attacked." And so it's important to note that you do not have control in all situations, and that students may encounter triggering content or individuals. So it's important to think about that, warn students about that beforehand. I mentioned mobility considerations a little bit because we need to make sure that our students that have mobility concerns can also use this technology if possible, because we need to be cognizant of that when we're choosing what applications to use. Also, you need to think about being in a secure environment with at least yourself monitoring that environment, because once you put that headset on, the real world goes away. And so if you don't feel safe and secure, you're not going to be able to actually take part in that experience. And the last piece is that accessibility, and how are you going to ensure that all students are able to go through this experience and get the same learning outcome? So what do you need to do? Or do we need to assign certain things differently? There's a lot of considerations with accessibility. So how can you use VR in your classroom? It's really important to think about this. So when you're going to think about VR in your class, I would like you to sit for a second and really consider, is there one particular assignment that I could take and transition that into a virtual reality assignment? Because that's all it takes, is one assignment to get started. Obviously, you have to have resources in place to do this, but once you have the resources figured out, it really just comes down to where is the best place I can implement this. I have a workshop page for you. So I mentioned the VR workshop, and I actually would like to share that page with you. I was the facilitator of this workshop, and we created this workshop web page, and it's a really great place for people who have never used this technology can go to get started. There's links to some of this same literature I shared with you, as well as additional literature. There's applications that you can that we recommend you start with to start thinking about how you use these technologies. So if you feel so inclined, take that QR code and open that workshop webpage and save that somewhere so that you can get back to it. I'll show it to you just for a moment so that you can see what it is. Let me see here. These controls at the top are a pain. Let's see if I can find it here. I'm gonna hide these. All right, so this is our virtual, our Transy VR workshop in the summer of 2022, and the before the workshop is probably one of the best pages because it will show you some of the literature. It has linked to videos, and those best practices that I shared with you are here a little bit in more detail. And it has a lot of content and a little bit about some of the research others are doing in virtual reality. So feel free to peruse this, save this somewhere if you feel so inclined. This is a picture from my class this semester. I wanted to show you what this looks like. So I call this VR in action because I'm actually implementing an entire course around virtual reality. The course it's a first year research seminar course. And we're focusing on the metaverse and how it can be used in society and how it's being used and what problems it can help solve. And so this is a picture. Here I am in the center of the screen walking around monitoring the situation, and then you have my students all around. And this is actually a promotional picture that they posted to our blog and our social media accounts. But what you'll see is that my students are interacting with the virtual environments here, and it can look interesting sometimes. If you look at the individual on the left here, he's doing a task in virtual reality. So it can be really fun to watch your students do this, because if you don't have the context that they do, it looks really funny. But they're doing a really amazing job looking at virtual reality and how it can solve problems in the world and some of the things that they're finding and in researching are things like safety. I have one individual who's a pre-law student, and they're going to focus on what laws we have in the real world and how those can be applied in virtual reality in those situations. So things like harassment, bullying, and how the rules and regulations we have in the real world, can they be applied virtually? Are they being applied? What changes will we need to make in the future to make that happen? I have other students who are interested in things like physical therapy, and so they're looking at the ways in which virtual reality can help with balance training, can help with pain management, and a series of other things. And then you've got students interested in athletics, and they're looking at how this can be used as a training tool for things like tennis and football, and how you, in a safer environment, can do more repetitions of a particular move or particular skill without doing that in a real world scenario where you risk injury. So I have students doing some really interesting work. And if I'm remembering correctly, this picture was taken when my students were doing an application called Mission ISS, which allows students to go into the International Space Station and learn to become an astronaut and do certain trainings that the astronauts do. That's really all I have for you today. And I know that was just a very quick overview. It was very surface level for those of you who might have a little bit more knowledge about virtual reality. But I'm open for questions. Yes, Bob?
Oh, gee, we could go on for another hour or two.
Yeah.
Is there a conference focused on virtual reality?
There are many conferences focused on virtual reality, and I can actually share some resources, Bob, with you if you can share it out to others, or I can add a slide and then add that to the PDF if you'd like. And what you'll find is that, like, I'm actually getting emails about the virtual reality and healthcare conference right now. So there's an entire conference in healthcare about how this can be used, how virtual reality can be used, from anything from can you see your doctor in virtual reality all the way through to doctor training, like I was talking about earlier with surgical training or tasks training and nurse training, PA training. There's so many things that it's being used for. So there's a whole conference on that. There's a developer conference that you could go to where it looks at how you develop these things. And almost every single teaching conference that I have seen in the last year has had something with VR in its sort of realm. And so I think that we're going to start seeing this in all the teaching and learning conferences, as well as just also individual conferences.
There's a plot line that's been on the TV show Chicago Med about using virtual reality and artificial intelligence in surgery. And that was an interesting part of the show. The other thing happens to be my master's is in counseling, and I can imagine using virtual reality with clients in counseling. You know, you can put them in situations that in real life would be threatening to them.
Yes.
And help them work through issues in virtual reality.
Yeah.
There's so many
and
possibilities.
I think about that too. I have a friend of mine who's a social worker, and she works with children that have oppositional defiance. And you can think about that, right? If you put a headset on them and walk them through a scenario and have them make choices, and then show them what choices would have been, how you could make those choices differently. And they could practice that over and over so that if a situation like that does arise, they're able to make those right choices during those situations. So yeah, Bob, I see it everywhere, ways that it could be used. So does anyone else think of ways that you and your particular field could use this technology and how you could implement it or want to implement it?
I'm actually a librarian and at a community college, and we have just put in a capital request through our budgeting process to create a lab in the library. One of the packages we're looking to purchase is something called Transfer, which is really focused on a lot of the applied technologies. And so For example, I mean, I changed the oil in a Corolla in virtual reality. And part of the idea behind it is it's also great for career exploration, getting people a sense of, well, hey, maybe I'd be interested in doing something like that because I have a taste of it. And so that's kind of one direction that we're looking at, almost as an enrollment tool, as a way for the library to contribute, and of course to work with faculty. And really excited to see your workshop, and that would be something that we might also do down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up, Diane, and thank you for coming. And one of my best resources is my librarians, because we're currently in my course where we're working with virtual reality, one of the things that's missing from the literature is the best practices for how you evaluate this content, just like you would evaluate just any other article for its, the CRAP analysis, right? The CRAAP analysis, if you know what I'm talking about. And so we've kind of taken that and adapted it for virtual reality. And so the same way you would look at, an article for its authenticity, we're doing the same thing for virtual reality. And so I'm trying to show students that, just because the information's there, it's not always accurate, just like with anything else. And virtual reality is no different. And we need to be assessing it in the same ways. And so I've been really working closely with our library, creating these resources. And so I think it takes the whole village, right, Diane? You got to get everybody together and on the same page for this to work.
Yeah,
No,
I see
we're out
community
of
college.
time. I'm
Are we?
sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that I see community colleges as a huge user of these because of the hands-on type training that they do. I can see it, and trying to get resources so that you can practice plumbing, so that you can practice electrical work, so that you can practice all that stuff. You can do a lot of this in virtual and then go do it in reality, and those types of things I think will be a big benefit. So, and I think they have the hardest job. No offense, as community colleges have such diversity and student body and so forth and so on, from language to everything else. It's a real challenge for those people. But I think an investment in virtual would be a huge thing for the community college systems.
Yep. Thank you, Dan.
Well, like I said, we could go on for another hour or two. This is so fascinating, but I've got another presenter waiting at the top of the hour to do their presentation. Man, JJ, thank you so much for this.
Absolutely. And Bob, I'll get that PDF to you. That way you can maybe put it on the website.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate it. This is excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.